Historical records from the Joseon Dynasty preserve a meticulous administrative memory, one that extended even into the most controlled and concealed spaces of royal life. Among these records, palace registries, court diaries, and legal documents reveal a system that not only elevated queens to symbolic authority, but also maintained precise mechanisms to remove, isolate, and redefine them when political necessity demanded it. The exile of queens was not an irregular anomaly, but a regulated outcome embedded within the governance structures of the dynasty. Surviving documents from institutions such as the Sungjiangwan, the Royal Secretariat, and the Wigwi, the detailed royal protocols, suggest that queens occupied a position that was simultaneously revered and precarious. While formally recognized as the mother of the nation, a queen's status depended heavily on her alignment with dominant political factions, her ability to produce heirs, and her relationship with the king's extended court. When these factors shifted, palace records indicate that removal could occur through legalistic procedures rather than overt violence. Chroniclers noted that accusations against queens often followed patterns consistent with broader factional struggles. Charges of moral impropriety, failure to uphold Confucian virtues, or alleged interference in state matters appear repeatedly in the annals of the Joseon Dynasty. These accusations were rarely isolated personal grievances. Instead, they reflected conflicts among scholar-official factions who used moral language as a framework for political action. Legal codes of the period reveal that such charges provided justification for deposition and subsequent exile, allowing the court to frame the removal as a restoration of moral order rather than a consolidation of power. The process of exile itself was highly structured. Palace records describe formal decrees issued by the king, often under pressure from court officials, outlining the reasons for deposition and specifying the conditions of exile. These decrees were copied, archived, and circulated among relevant administrative offices. The precision of this documentation indicates that exile was not an impulsive decision, but an institutional response governed by precedent and bureaucratic procedure. Contemporary accounts describe how exiled queens were relocated to designated residences outside the central capital of Hanseong, present-day Seoul. These locations were neither entirely free nor overtly punitive in the sense of imprisonment. Instead, they functioned as controlled environments where the former queen's movements, communications, and daily life were carefully monitored. Surviving logistical records detail the allocation of attendants, provisions, and security personnel assigned to these residences, suggesting that exile was designed to maintain a balance between dignity and restriction. The daily conditions of these exiled queens reveal a controlled continuity of royal life, albeit in a diminished form. Palace supply logs indicate that they continued to receive food, clothing, and ritual items appropriate to their former status, though often at reduced quantities or quality. This regulated provision underscores the dual objective of exile: to remove political influence while preserving the symbolic integrity of the monarchy. Stripping a queen entirely of her status risked undermining the ideological framework of the dynasty, which emphasized hierarchical order and filial piety. Surviving correspondence records suggest that communication between exiled queens and the central court was heavily restricted. Requests for information or appeals for reinstatement were subject to strict review processes. In many cases, these documents reveal a prolonged silence imposed upon the exiled individual, effectively erasing her from active political discourse. This silence was not merely social but administrative, as her name and presence were gradually excluded from ongoing records, ceremonies, and genealogical updates. Legal codes of the period further reveal that the exile of a queen often extended its consequences to her natal family. Relatives could face demotion, removal from office, or surveillance, depending on the severity of the accusations. This broader impact reflects the interconnected nature of political alliances within the Joseon system, where familial networks played a central role in governance. By targeting the family, the state reinforced its authority and discouraged resistance. Chroniclers noted that the emotional dimensions of exile were rarely documented directly. Instead, the records maintain a consistent tone of administrative neutrality. However, the absence of personal expression itself suggests a deliberate suppression of individual narrative. The system prioritized order and continuity over personal experience, leaving modern historians to interpret the lived reality of exile through indirect evidence. In some cases, palace records indicate that exiled queens were later reinstated. These reversals were typically associated with shifts in political power, changes in factional dominance, or the death of key opponents. The documentation surrounding reinstatement mirrors that of exile, emphasizing formal decrees and ritual restoration. This symmetry highlights the procedural nature of both removal and return, reinforcing the idea that queenship was defined as much by institutional recognition as by personal identity. The mechanisms that govern these transitions reveal a broader pattern within the Joseon political system. Authority was maintained not through arbitrary action, but through codified procedures that framed political decisions as moral necessities. By embedding exile within a legal and ethical framework, the state ensured that its actions could be justified within the prevailing Confucian ideology. Surviving documents also suggest that the physical spaces associated with exile were carefully selected. Residences were often located at a distance sufficient to prevent direct influence over court affairs, yet close enough to allow for surveillance and control. Geographic records indicate that these sites were integrated into existing administrative networks, enabling efficient communication between local officials and the central government. This integration reflects the logistical sophistication of the Joseon bureaucracy. The role of attendants assigned to exiled queens provides further insight into the system of control. Palace staffing records detail the selection and rotation of these individuals, indicating that loyalty and reliability were key considerations. Attendants acted not only as servants but also as intermediaries between the exiled queen and the state, reporting on her activities and ensuring compliance with restrictions. This dual function underscores the surveillance aspect of exile, which operated alongside its symbolic and administrative dimensions. Chroniclers noted that ritual practices continued to play a role in the lives of exiled queens. Records of ancestral rites and seasonal ceremonies indicate that participation was permitted under controlled conditions. These practices served to maintain a connection between the exiled individual and the broader cosmological order, reinforcing the legitimacy of the monarchy even in moments of internal disruption. The cumulative evidence from palace records reveals a system that managed the removal of queens with a combination of legal precision, ideological justification, and logistical coordination. Exile functioned as a tool for maintaining stability within a complex political environment, where personal relationships and factional dynamics intersected with institutional authority. At the same time, the records suggest that this system imposed a profound transformation on those subjected to it. The transition from central authority to controlled isolation represents a shift not only in physical location, but in social and political identity. While the documentation remains restrained, the implications of this transformation are evident in the patterns of regulation, restriction, and gradual erasure that define the archival record. As these documents continue to be studied, they offer a window into the inner workings of a dynasty that sought to balance moral ideology with political necessity. The exile of queens, as revealed through these records, reflects the broader principles that govern Joseon society, principles that prioritized order, hierarchy, and continuity, even at the cost of individual autonomy. Surviving entries within the annals of the Joseon Dynasty suggest that the administrative handling of exiled queens did not end with their relocation. Instead, their existence continued to be monitored through a dispersed network of officials whose reports fed back into the central record-keeping system. These entries, often brief and formulaic, indicate periodic reviews of the exiled queen's conduct, health, and adherence to imposed restrictions. The tone remains consistent, measured, procedural, and devoid of overt interpretation. Yet the persistence of such monitoring reveals the state's ongoing concern with containment rather than mere removal. Contemporary accounts describe how local magistrates assigned to oversee these residences operated under explicit directives. They were required to maintain a balance between enforcing royal orders and preserving the outward dignity of the individual they supervised. This dual expectation is reflected in administrative correspondence, where officials reported both compliance and any deviations, however minor. In this way, exile became a continuous administrative process, rather than a single decisive act. The structure of governance within the Joseon Dynasty placed significant emphasis on documentation as a means of control. Every action taken against a queen, whether deposition, relocation, or restriction, was recorded in multiple layers of bureaucracy. The duplication of records across offices ensured that no single narrative could dominate unchecked. Instead, a composite account emerged, shaped by the perspectives of various officials, each adhering to the formal language of Confucian governance. Legal codes of the period reveal that exile was often accompanied by a formal reclassification of status. A deposed queen might be reassigned a lesser title or referred to in records without honorific designation. This shift in terminology was not incidental. It represented a deliberate redefinition of identity within the hierarchical order. By altering the language used to describe the individual, the state effectively recalibrated her position within the social and political structure. Chroniclers noted that this reclassification extended into ritual practice. The participation of an exiled queen in state ceremonies was either curtailed or eliminated entirely. Surviving ritual manuals indicate that adjustments were made to accommodate her absence, often without explicit acknowledgement. This omission functioned as a subtle yet powerful form of erasure, aligning ceremonial practice with the revised political reality. At the same time, records suggest that complete isolation was neither practical nor desirable from the perspective of governance. Controlled channels of communication were maintained, allowing the court to issue instructions and receive reports. These channels were tightly regulated, with messages subject to review and approval before transmission. The resulting correspondence reflects a constrained form of interaction, shaped by protocol rather than personal expression. The impact of exile on succession politics emerges clearly in palace documents. In cases where a queen had borne a royal heir, her deposition introduced complexities into the line of succession. Surviving deliberations among court officials reveal careful consideration of these implications. The legitimacy of the heir was often upheld, even as the mother's status was diminished. This distinction underscores the pragmatic dimension of Joseon governance, where ideological consistency was balanced against the need for political stability. In other instances, exile intersected with broader purges of political factions. Records indicate that the removal of a queen could coincide with the dismissal or punishment of officials aligned with her natal family. These coordinated actions suggest a strategic approach, in which exile served as one component of a larger effort to restructure the balance of power within the court. The language used in these records remains formal and restrained, yet the pattern of simultaneous actions points to a deliberate consolidation of authority. Surviving documents also provide insight into the material conditions of exile over time. Initial provisions, while reduced, often maintained a semblance of royal standard. However, subsequent records indicate adjustments based on changing circumstances, including shifts in political favor or resource availability. These changes were documented with administrative precision, reflecting the broader fiscal management practices of the dynasty. Chroniclers noted that illness and mortality among exiled queens were recorded in the same detached manner as other aspects of their lives. Reports of declining health were submitted by local officials and incorporated into central records without elaboration. In cases of death, the procedures for burial and posthumous recognition were governed by specific regulations. These procedures often reflected the individual's reclassified status, resulting in funerary practices that differed from those accorded to reigning queens. The treatment of memory within the historical record reveals another dimension of control. The compilation of official histories involved a process of selection and interpretation, guided by established norms and political considerations. In some cases, references to exiled queens were minimized or framed in ways that emphasized moral lessons aligned with Confucian ideals. This editorial approach shaped the long-term perception of these individuals, integrating their experiences into a broader narrative of governance and virtue. At the same time, discrepancies between different types of records, such as court diaries, administrative logs, and later compilations, suggest that the process of documentation was not entirely uniform. Variations in detail and emphasis indicate that multiple perspectives coexisted within the archival system. These differences provide modern historians with opportunities to reconstruct a more nuanced understanding of exile, though always within the constraints of available evidence. The role of the king in these processes appears both central and mediated. Formal decrees bear the authority of the monarch, yet surviving records indicate that decisions were often shaped by consultation with senior officials. Memorials submitted to the throne reveal arguments grounded in moral philosophy, legal precedent, and political expediency. The king's response, as recorded in official documents, typically aligns with these recommendations, suggesting a collaborative dynamic within the upper levels of governance. This dynamic reflects the broader structure of the Joseon state, where the monarchy operated within a framework of institutionalized advisory systems. The exile of a queen, while presented as a royal decision, was thus embedded within a network of deliberation and consensus. This structure allowed for the distribution of responsibility, reinforcing the legitimacy of the outcome. Surviving correspondence also indicates that appeals for reconsideration were not entirely absent. In some cases, petitions were submitted on behalf of exiled queens, often by family members or sympathetic officials. These petitions invoked principles of justice, precedent, and compassion, seeking to reopen deliberation. The responses to such appeals, when recorded, tend to reaffirm the original decision, though occasionally they result in modifications to the conditions of exile. The existence of these appeals highlights the tension between rigidity and flexibility within the system. While the formal procedures of exile were designed to project stability and order, the possibility of revision indicates an underlying adaptability. This adaptability, however, remained constrained by the overarching priorities of governance. Chroniclers noted that the passage of time could alter the perception of an exiled queen's case. As political contexts shifted, earlier decisions were sometimes reevaluated. This reevaluation was reflected in posthumous honors or adjustments to historical records. Such actions suggest an ongoing negotiation between past decisions and present considerations, mediated through the mechanisms of documentation and ritual. The cumulative evidence from these records portrays exile not as an endpoint, but as a prolonged condition, managed through continuous oversight and periodic reassessment. The system's emphasis on documentation ensured that every aspect of this condition was recorded, analyzed, and integrated into the broader framework of state governance. Through this lens, the experiences of exiled queens can be understood as part of a larger pattern within the Joseon Dynasty, one in which power was exercised through procedures, language, and record-keeping as much as through direct action. The restraint evident in the surviving documents reflects a deliberate effort to maintain order and legitimacy, even in situations marked by personal displacement and political conflict. The archival legacy of these practices continues to shape modern interpretations, offering a detailed yet carefully mediated account of how authority was asserted, contested, and preserved within one of East Asia's most enduring dynastic systems. The accumulated documentation of the Joseon Dynasty ultimately reveals that exile was not simply a political tool applied in moments of crisis, but an integrated mechanism within a broader system of governance that relied on continuity, precedent, and controlled interpretation. The removal of a queen, while framed through moral justification, functioned as a recalibration of authority, carefully managed to avoid destabilizing the ideological foundations of the state. Surviving entries in the annals of the Joseon Dynasty suggest that the long-term consequences of exile extended beyond the lifetime of the individuals involved. The treatment of these cases in official histories indicates an effort to align past events with prevailing interpretations of Confucian virtue. Chroniclers often emphasize the restoration of order following a queen's removal, framing the outcome as evidence of the dynasty's moral resilience. This retrospective framing shaped how later generations understood the relationship between personal conduct and political authority. Legal codes of the period reveal that the precedent established by earlier cases influenced subsequent decisions. When similar accusations arose, officials frequently referenced prior exiles as justification for their recommendations. This reliance on precedent reinforced the perception of consistency, even as each case was shaped by its own political context. The repetition of procedural language across records further contributed to this sense of continuity, embedding individual experiences within an enduring administrative pattern. At the level of daily governance, the existence of exiled queens required ongoing allocation of resources and attention. Administrative logs indicate that provisions, personnel assignments, and reporting obligations were maintained over extended periods, sometimes spanning decades. This sustained commitment reflects the state's recognition that exile, once imposed, created a lasting responsibility. The management of these responsibilities was distributed across multiple layers of bureaucracy, ensuring that no single office bore the entire burden. Chroniclers noted that the physical spaces associated with exile often developed their own localized routines. While these routines remained subject to central oversight, they were shaped by the practical realities of distance and regional administration. Reports from local officials occasionally reveal adjustments made to accommodate environmental conditions, resource availability, or logistical constraints. These adaptations, though limited, suggest that the system of exile was not entirely rigid, but capable of incremental modification within defined boundaries. The question of reintegration remained a persistent undercurrent within the archival record. In rare instances where exiled queens were restored to their former status, the documentation emphasizes the formal processes required to reverse earlier decisions. Decrees announcing reinstatement were accompanied by detailed instructions regarding titles, ceremonies, and record corrections. This emphasis on procedure underscores the importance of maintaining coherence within the administrative system, even when revising its outcomes. More commonly, however, exile concluded without reversal. In these cases, the final stages of documentation focus on death and posthumous treatment. Surviving records indicate that decisions regarding burial rites and ancestral recognition were carefully calibrated to reflect the individual's adjusted status. These decisions carried implications not only for the memory of the queen, but also for the standing of her descendants. The management of lineage and inheritance, central to Confucian social order, required that such matters be resolved with clarity. The role of historical compilation in shaping collective memory becomes particularly evident in these contexts. The process of assembling official histories involved selecting, organizing, and interpreting earlier records. This process was guided by both methodological standards and contemporary priorities. As a result, the portrayal of exiled queens within these histories often reflects a synthesis of factual documentation and moral interpretation. The emphasis on lessons derived from these cases aligns with the broader function of historical writing in Joseon society, which served as a guide for governance as much as a record of events. At the same time, the limitations of the archival record must be acknowledged. The consistent use of formal language and the absence of personal testimony constrain the ability to reconstruct the subjective experiences of those involved. Historians rely on indirect evidence, patterns of provision, frequency of reports, and changes in terminology to infer aspects of daily life and emotional condition. This method of interpretation requires caution, as it depends on reading between the lines of documents designed to prioritize order over individuality. Despite these limitations, certain patterns emerge with clarity. The system of exile operated through a combination of surveillance, restriction, and symbolic continuity. It sought to neutralize political influence while preserving the outward structure of monarchy. This balance reflects a broader principle within the Joseon state: the need to manage change without undermining the ideological framework that justified authority. The involvement of multiple institutions in the administration of exile further illustrates the complexity of governance. The royal secretariat, local magistrates, and various advisory bodies each played a role in implementing and monitoring decisions. The coordination among these entities was facilitated by standardized procedures and shared adherence to Confucian norms. This institutional integration contributed to the durability of the system, allowing it to function consistently across different reigns and political contexts. Chroniclers noted that the language used in records of exile remained remarkably stable over time. Terms associated with moral failure, correction, and restoration appear with regularity, regardless of the specific circumstances of each case. This linguistic consistency reinforced the perception that the system operated according to established principles rather than arbitrary judgment. It also provided a framework through which officials could articulate their recommendations and justify their actions. The broader social implications of these practices extend beyond the confines of the palace. The visibility of a queen's fall from authority, even when mediated through controlled documentation, served as a reminder of the expectations placed upon individuals within the hierarchical order. The emphasis on virtue, propriety, and obedience was reinforced through these examples, contributing to the maintenance of social norms. At the same time, the reliance on exile as a mechanism of control reveals an inherent tension within the system. The need to remove individuals who threatened political stability coexisted with the imperative to uphold the sanctity of royal institutions. This tension was managed through procedural rigor and ideological framing, allowing the state to navigate potential contradictions without openly acknowledging them. Surviving documents suggest that the legacy of exiled queens continued to influence political discourse long after their removal. References to earlier cases appear in debates among officials, serving as points of comparison or caution. These references indicate that the memory of exile functioned as a resource within the decision-making process, shaping how new situations were understood and addressed. The cumulative weight of this archival evidence points to a system in which power was exercised through sustained attention to detail. The meticulous recording of actions, the careful calibration of language, and the integration of multiple administrative layers all contributed to a form of governance that prioritized predictability and control. Within this system, the exile of queens emerges not as an exception, but as a predictable outcome under certain conditions. Modern scholarship continues to engage with these records, seeking to understand both their content and their construction. The study of exile within the Joseon Dynasty provides insight into the ways in which states manage internal challenges while maintaining ideological coherence. It also highlights the role of documentation in shaping both contemporary governance and historical memory. The absence of overt narrative within the records invites a form of interpretation that is necessarily cautious and analytical. Yet within this restraint, the outlines of lived experience can still be discerned. The regulated routines, the monitored communications, and the gradual redefinition of identity all point to a condition that was at once structured and deeply transformative. As the surviving documents are examined in their entirety, they reveal a system that sought to contain disruption through order, to redefine individuals through language, and to preserve authority through procedure. The exiled queens of the Joseon Dynasty, as recorded in these palace archives, occupy a space shaped by these forces, a space where personal fate was inseparable from the mechanisms of the state, and where the boundaries of power were enforced not only through action, but through the enduring record of that action.